Welcome to Dialogue.
This conversation is part of our ongoing series, Trust the Experts, and today we are focusing on psychologists and therapists.
Okay, let's unpack this. When you look at the history of how people have dealt with emotional pain for centuries, it was a decentralized thing.
It really was. You relied on your family, maybe on prayer, on community elders, you had cultural traditions.
And what's so striking about that whole system was this kind of built-in humility. Nobody claimed to have all the answers.
Exactly. They were honest about it. If someone was suffering, the community would gather around, but they'd acknowledge that they didn't fully understand the internal mechanics of that person's pain.
There was a mystery to it.
Yes. And what's fascinating here is the precise moment that dynamic just fundamentally shifted. A new professional class, psychology, arrived on the scene.
And they came with a very different claim.
A completely different claim. They said, with this absolute, almost astonishing confidence, that they did understand the pain. They understood its causes, its secret language, and how to fix it.
So they established a new kind of authority, one based entirely on their theories and their specific language. It's like they created a firewall, really, between a person's own experience and the expert's supposed superior insight.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So our mission today is to dive into some key historical moments where that therapeutic certainty, which was, often just philosophical and totally untested, may have actually caused significant generational harm.
This is a story about how certainty itself, much more than any kind of malice, led to some really serious collateral damage.
Right. Damage for the very people seeking help and for their families. We're really trying to help you recognize the difference between genuine help that empowers you and this sort of unexamined authority that demands you fit your life into its pre-made box.
Because we have to understand, early psychology was revolutionary in what it claimed it could do.
Huge claims.
Huge. It positioned itself as the ultimate guide to the self. It wasn't just promising symptom relief, it was promising the full explanation for the human condition. And the cost of that promise, as we're about to see, was often paid by the people who trusted it the most.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for me. We tend to associate modern therapy with hard science, with peer-reviewed studies, maybe brain scans, data.
The white lab coat image.
Exactly. But when psychology first emerged as a discipline, say, late 19th, early 20th century, it was pure speculation.
It's so vital to remember that the foundations of modern therapy were fundamentally philosophical. They were not biological.
So it wasn't coming out of a lab.
Not at all. I mean, you have to think, this is before we had any of the technology we rely on today. No objective tests, no quantitative data, and certainly no way to study a living brain.
So where did these massive sweeping theories about human suffering and destiny, where did they come from?
They came directly from the personal observations and, frankly, the personal obsessions of a few highly influential and often quite isolated men.
And crucially, these weren't treated as, hypotheses to be tested.
Oh, they were presented with absolute certainty. They were published as if they were immutable laws of the human psyche, like the law of gravity.
So once these ideas got a foothold in universities and professional circles, they became the new truth.
They did. And if a therapist then diagnosed your issue based on a framework that was developed in, say, a Viennese study, your family, and you were pretty much expected to immediately conform your reality to fit that diagnosis.
Questions asked.
Very few. This declaration of authority, this idea that we have the special language, therefore we have the ultimate truth, is best demonstrated by the towering figure of Sigmund Freud.
Of course. It always comes back to Freud.
It has to start there. He looked at this vast, messy, confusing spectrum of human emotional life.
Anxiety, depression, anger.
All of it. Neurosis, chronic confusion. And he distilled it all down to one single overriding cause.
Which was?
Repressed sexual desire and unresolved conflicts from our earliest psychosexual development.
It's astonishingly reductive when you really step back and look at it.
It is. So, if you were a high-functioning person with anxiety, well, that was a manifestation of some unresolved libidinal conflict.
And if you were struggling with what we might call severe situational depression today?
Well, that would be traced back to the Oedipal complex or some other form of sexual blockage from your childhood.
It was a one-size-fits-all explanation for basically everything.
Everything. The entirety of human motivation. But it came wrapped in this very compelling language of undeniable insight. And this theoretical construction led directly to the core institutional flaw that we see repeated for the next 100 years.
The self-proving theory.
Exactly, the self-proving theory.
I think we really need to linger on that concept because it's the fundamental mechanism that protected the expert from ever being wrong.
It is. It's the key.
Yeah.
So Freud introduces this concept of resistance. If a patient comes into therapy and over time they accept the diagnosis, let's say they accept that their fear of intimacy comes from an unconscious desire for their mother. That acceptance was immediately seized upon as objective proof. Proof that the theory was correct. The patient has finally broken through and uncovered the deep truth.
That part makes a certain kind of sense. But here's the genius of it and the profound danger. What happens when the patient rejects the diagnosis?
Right. What if they say, "Doctor, with all due respect, I really don't believe my anxiety has anything to do with my parents"?
I think it has to do with the fact that I just lost my job.
Exactly. Well, the theory protected itself. That rejection was deemed resistance.
So their denial was also proof.
Also proof. The patient's disagreement, their insistence on their own lived reality, wasn't seen as a rational objection. It was interpreted as the unconscious mind actively fighting against the painful, objective truth that only the therapist could see.
That is the ultimate intellectual trap.
It is.
The theory can literally never be wrong. Any data point you provide, whether you accept it or reject it, is used to confirm the theory's validity.
You've created a situation where the patient's own instincts, their own knowledge of their history, their self-perception, it's all dismissed as inherently unreliable.
Because it's contaminated by their own resistance.
Precisely. The expert's interpretation, by definition, always wins.
And the immediate devastating social consequence of this was this profound tendency to blame the family.
To locate the root cause of all neurosis and suffering within the nuclear family, and very specifically with the parents. The mother especially was often seen as the primary object of the child's earliest repressed desires and conflicts.
So she became the default target for blame for pretty much every psychological problem imaginable.
This parental blame became an endemic feature of therapy culture for decades, long after Freud. But the most alarming example of this certainty, the one with truly generational consequences, was the reinterpretation of trauma.
Right. We know that early in his practice, Freud was hearing accounts of childhood sexual abuse from his female patients.
He was, and for a brief period, he accepted these reports as factual. He believed them.
But then he changed his mind.
He did. Faced with the shocking reality that abuse was systemic, and maybe concerned about the social fallout of labeling prominent, upper-middle-class Viennese fathers as predators, he famously retreated from this clinical finding.
And he decided what? That they were all making it up.
He decided the abuse reports were not evidence of actual events, but were, in his words, mere fantasies or screen memories.
So projections of the child's own unconscious repressed sexual desires.
Exactly.
This is such a crucial historical pivot point because it institutionalizes the idea that the expert's interpretation is more real than the victim's reality.
It's a complete transfer of authority over truth. Instead of listening to the victim, the expert's abstract, theoretical model of the subconscious just supersedes the reported facts.
And that process didn't just dismiss their instincts, it actively silenced them. It gave license for genuine harm to continue, all justified by this theoretical structure that could never be contradicted by something as messy as a fact.
The expert was effectively saying, "You think you remember this physical event, but I, the interpreter of your mind, know that you are simply projecting your repressed desires onto your father figure." The authority shifts from the person who lived it to the person with the theory.
And this leads right into the second massive consequence of that era, the powerful and very convenient explanation of repression.
This is such a consequential idea. Psychology introduced this concept that painful or traumatic memories weren't simply forgotten or processed or faded over time.
No, they were actively pushed down into the unconscious.
Pushed down and just waiting there to be unearthed and decoded by the expert.
This completely changes the game when it comes to memory, doesn't it?
It completely shifts the locus of authority. If a memory is just repressed, it means that the individual who lived the experience no longer has the final say on what happened in their own past.
Their own memory is inherently incomplete. It needs the professional decoder to make sense of it.
Right, so the ultimate authority shifts to the therapist who is interpreting the alleged invisible memory. And the implications for family life were just enormous.
I can imagine. If a patient reports a repressed memory of harm and the family denies it,
That denial itself is immediately viewed with suspicion. It's seen as them covering up the repressed truth or maybe even engaging in their own unconscious resistance.
It creates this profound paradox in the therapy room, one that we see repeated again and again. What happens if a patient starts to feel worse after starting therapy?
The therapist could, and often did, frame it as a sign of success
How?
by saying, "This is proof the therapy is working. We are finally accessing the deep, painful truths that your unconscious fought so hard to keep hidden."
So your worsening condition becomes evidence of success rather than a sign that the method might be flawed.
Precisely. The patient has to get sicker to prove that they're on the path to getting better. It's a devastating cognitive loop.
And it essentially guarantees that the theoretical model can never be blamed for anything.
Never. When you construct a system where both acceptance and rejection confirm your theory, you've created an authoritative structure that's impossible to challenge, no matter how much real-world harm it's inflicting on the patient and their relationships.
So if we look at the sweep of the early 20th century, you see the field, especially in America, getting really uncomfortable with this. The lack of empirical grounding in Freud, it felt too speculative.
It felt too philosophical, yes. All this focus on unseen, sexualized inner conflict, but instead of grounding itself in a more robust, evidence-based science.
It just swung violently in the other direction.
That's the critical pivot. The field moves from overanalyzing the unseen mind with Freud to effectively ignoring the mind entirely with behaviorism.
This was driven by a kind of American pragmatism, right? The idea that if you can't objectively measure it, it doesn't count as science.
Exactly. They essentially declared the unconscious is too messy, it's too philosophical. Let's only look at what we can observe and quantify.
So psychologists decided that the inner world, feelings, motivations, complex narratives, hopes, fears, it's all just too subjective, too unreliable to study scientifically.
And they reduced human beings entirely to a sequence of stimulus and response.
Uh.
The goal was to treat the human mind like a black box.
We only care about the input and the output. We don't care about the messy machinery inside.
You've got it. We are effectively treating humans like highly complicated but ultimately predictable machines.
This was a radical act of reductionism. It must have had huge implications for how we understood things like virtue or relationships.
Massive implications. Under behaviorism, concepts like love or empathy, they weren't innate human experiences anymore. They became mere conditioning, a series of reinforced habits.
So morality isn't your conscience or your purpose. It's just a habit that needs external correction.
Right. And emotional pain wasn't suffering to be understood. It was simply a behavior that needed correction through meticulously controlled reward and punishment cycles. The complexity of what it means to be human was just erased.
And the practical application of this, especially with children, was often shocking. The foundational example here, and it's a difficult one, is the famous or infamous Little Albert experiment.
Conducted by John B. Watson in 1920. This was a stark, disturbing case of a psychologist intentionally traumatizing a baby to prove a purely theoretical point about conditioning.
The details here are really crucial for understanding the moral landscape of the expert class at the time.
They are. Watson wanted to prove that fear, this complex human emotion, could be manufactured entirely through classical conditioning. So they took this 9-month-old baby, little Albert, who was reportedly very placid and happy.
And Albert showed no initial fear of various things, including a white rat.
None at all, so they set the trap. Every time Albert reached out for this harmless little animal, they paired the sight of the rat with an extremely loud, frightening noise.
A banging hammer against a steel bar.
Yes. The child was, of course, startled and terrified by the noise. It's a natural, unconditioned response.
And the conditioning was fast.
Very fast and very effective. Albert quickly associated the sight of the white rat with that terrifying sound. Soon, just seeing the animal was enough to make him cry intensely and try to crawl away.
But they didn't stop there, did they?
No. They proved that this manufactured fear generalized. Albert started showing the same fear response to other similar objects. A white rabbit, a furry coat, even a Santa Claus mask. The conditioning was a total success.
And here is the ethical failure that really defines the whole problem of this kind of expert authority.
The fear was never undone.
Never undone. The experiment ended, the psychologist moved on with his career, he published his findings, and the child was left, presumably, with a lasting conditioned phobia that was never treated.
And this wasn't seen as a deep violation or an abuse of power. It was documented and published as undeniable scientific progress.
It proved the theory that human emotion could be mechanically controlled, even created, by the expert.
The science, the purity of the theoretical proof, was more important than the well-being of the individual human subject. And this cold clinical philosophy quickly trickled down into parenting guides.
Which led directly to the now infamous anti-affection policies of the 1920s and 30s.
This is where we see the experts directly advising parents on how to handle their children's emotional needs. And based on this behaviorist advice, parents were told that they must deny their babies spontaneous affection,
No cuddling, no warm responses to distress.
all to prevent dangerous dependence and what they saw as weak character development.
The advice was incredibly clinical and rigid.
Schedules were everything. Responding warmly to a crying child was labeled a conditioning error. It would teach the child that distress leads to a payoff, which was affection.
I think Watson's own advice was something like, never hug and kiss them, never let them sit in your lap.
Yes. If you must, kiss them once on the forehead when they say goodnight. The stated goal was to raise an emotionally resilient, purely rational adult machine.
And families, desperate to follow the latest science and do the right thing for their children, they followed this advice religiously.
They were terrified of ruining their children by showing too much love. Think about that.
And the long-term cost of this was high and deeply ironic.
Profoundly. These expert-advised policies created a generation of emotionally distant, often stunted children. Decades later, when those children grew up and struggled to form deep, meaningful, connected relationships.
What we now call attachment issues.
Exactly. The blame was located, once again, within the individual or the family structure, not in the expert advice that caused the emotional distance in the first place.
So the expert provides the policy that creates the problem, and then a new generation of experts profits by diagnosing the consequences of that policy as the child's own inherent flaw.
It's a perfect feedback loop for the profession. The advice creates the problem, and then the field gets to diagnose the results.
We have to also address another major application of this reductionist thinking, one that claimed to provide an objective, undeniable measure of the human mind.
Intelligence testing. The IQ test. It wasn't presented just as a tool for assessment. It was presented as a precise scientific measure of biological destiny.
And this is where the sociological consequences just become devastating. Psychology was claiming authority over a person's entire future.
Right. While intelligence testing, which was initially developed by Binet in France, was intended to identify children who needed extra help.
When it was adopted in the United States, it was weaponized.
Completely. What was really being measured was not some innate universal intellectual potential. It was cultural familiarity. It was English language acquisition. It was compliance with a very specific testing structure.
The tests were inherently a product of a specific viewpoint, weren't they? A Western, educated, middle-class viewpoint.
Absolutely. Think about the questions. Early versions had questions that assumed you knew about American cultural institutions or sports or our monetary system.
So for a newly arrived immigrant or a child from a dramatically different cultural background,
a low score reflected a lack of exposure, not a lack of intelligence. But that's not how it was interpreted.
this raises such an important question. Psychology didn't just passively describe existing inequality here. It actively provided what looked like a scientific justification for it.
It cloaked social prejudice in the language of objective measurement.
Exactly. The test results, stamped with the authority of hard science, were used to label entire groups as intellectually inferior, especially during the big waves of European immigration.
Psychologists at Ellis Island administered these tests. And because non-native English speakers were often confused by the questions or intimidated by the whole context, huge numbers of people, Italians, Poles, Jews, were officially labeled as morons or feeble-minded.
It sounds almost unbelievable now, but this data was taken so seriously that it directly influenced immigration policy.
It did. These findings were used in Congress to argue that certain groups were biologically unfit for American society. It contributed directly to the restrictive immigration quotas of the 1920s.
And it wasn't just immigration. Domestically, these test results were used to track children into permanent academic and vocational limitations from a very young age.
Regardless of their actual potential, a single score delivered with the absolute certainty of an expert could determine a child's entire path in life.
So opportunities just vanished under the weight of a number that was presented as their biological destiny. The expert didn't just label you, they provided the scientific justification for the systemic limitations that were then placed upon you.
And if you look at the trajectory from the Freudian era, with its focus on this unseen, unconscious certainty, to the behaviorist era, with its focus on mechanistic certainty,
You see this profound repeating pattern. A theoretical framework is introduced with absolute confidence.
and then it's used to assign Blame, or justification, or permanent limitation usually aimed at the most vulnerable party, the child, the parent, the culturally disadvantaged group.
And this framework of reductionism and blame didn't just disappear, it just changed its clothes as the field evolved. It wrapped itself in newer, more sophisticated language.
We've covered the old theories, the ones that feel kind of distant and archaic now. But these methods of using theory to create guilt, they persist.
Let's look at how modern ideas, even good ones, got weaponized. Starting with attachment theory, which is, it's everywhere today.
It's everywhere. And the research itself, from John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, started with really necessary and careful nuance. It was a crucial framework for understanding the importance of early bonds.
But when that theory entered mainstream therapy and self-help culture,
that nuance was just stripped away. What was left was this sharp, punishing focus on parental blame, which created an environment of perpetual anxiety for parents.
it created what you could call the impossible standard for parenting.
That's a great term for it. Since the parent, and in popular culture, it's almost always the mother, is responsible for creating the foundation of the child's emotional security.
Secure attachment.
Right. She is therefore held entirely responsible when that foundation shows any cracks, regardless of external factors like poverty or lack of community support or societal pressures.
And this creates these impossible double binds for parents.
It really does. If you're too close, you risk enmeshment. You're creating a dependent adult, and that's framed as damaging.
But if you maintain some distance, you're creating an avoidant attachment style. And that's also damaging.
If you're a working parent, the time away is often interpreted as a source of insecurity for the child.
And I think the most painful one is if you have an anxious or high-needs child. The therapeutic interpretation often defaults to locating the problem not in the child's own temperament, but in the parent's failure to regulate their own anxiety.
The parent becomes the primary patient. They're burdened with this weight of having to generate perfect psychological health in their child, which is impossible.
So the result of this widespread interpretation is a culture where normal human imperfection, a minor argument, a few days of being distracted,
A moment of emotional unavailability.
is reframed as causing permanent, irreversible harm. The theory requires the parent to be flawless.
And when the child inevitably struggles, as all humans do, the fault is located entirely in the historical actions of the parent. Guilt replaced practical guidance, leaving families paralyzed by these impossible standards.
And this atmosphere of anxiety and suspicion, this constant search for repressed parental failure, it really paved the way for the most dramatic and devastating crisis of authority in late 20th century therapy.
The recovered memory era.
A direct, full-circle echo of Freud's idea of repression, but applied with a modern, almost fanatical intensity.
It was a period where many therapists truly overreached. They were convinced that they could unlock these deep, repressed, often horrific memories of childhood abuse that the patient had no conscious knowledge of.
And this movement was so catastrophic because it leveraged the idea that the truth must be buried. And if the patient couldn't access it, well, they just weren't digging hard enough.
So therapists encouraged the creation of these memories through highly suggestive and manipulative techniques.
Like
Hypnosis, guided imagery where patients were told to visit the past, intense and repeated questioning designed not to find facts, but to fill the gaps in a patient's memory with a certain narrative.
Patients were essentially encouraged to imagine abuse, and through the intense pressure and the absolute certainty of the therapist, that imagination solidified into what felt like a real belief.
The consequences were apocalyptic for tens of thousands of families.
The scale of this was just massive. Families were accused, often with zero external corroborating evidence beyond these newly recovered memories, which, to be fair, felt completely real to the patient.
Parents were disowned, marriages dissolved. The legal systems were overwhelmed with cases based entirely on recollections that were induced inside the therapy room.
What's so fascinating is how the field responded when the science finally caught up.
Right. Cognitive scientists proved conclusively that suggested memories are often indistinguishable from real ones in a person's mind. The entire movement was shown to have no basic scientific validity.
So the accusations often collapsed, the legal system backed away, and the professional bodies acknowledged the error.
But the damage was permanent. The families were never repaired. The bonds that were broken, the public shaming, the legal trauma, those relationships were often permanently shattered.
And psychology as a professional establishment.
It just quietly moved on. It moved on to the next theory, There was rarely any systematic effort to correct the record, to admit the institutional scale of the error, or to support the thousands of families that had been shattered by what was essentially a mass error, all based on unexamined certainty.
The professional apparatus protected its own reputation, while the collateral damage, the ruined lives and shattered families, remained devastatingly real.
It's a stark testament to the danger of the expert claiming total authority over a person's truth.
So, what does this all mean? If these dominant historical theories, from Freud to behaviorism to the recovered memory movement, so often led to misplaced blame or family breakdown or institutional prejudice, what was the actual payoff for the person seeking help?
For a great number of people, the central promise of insight, this belief that just understanding why you hurt would automatically bring relief, it often failed to materialize.
Instead of relief, they found rumination.
Profound, consuming rumination. Therapy sessions, especially those focused heavily on dredging up the past and assigning blame, they frequently became a weekly rehearsal of pain.
You show up, you practice the painful narrative, you receive this deep analysis of your problems, but often there's no real functional change in how you live your life.
This rigorous analysis frequently led to what we call identity fusion with diagnosis. The process of repeatedly analyzing your pain means that suffering shifts from being a temporary condition you need to transcend.
Into the core narrative of who you are, I have depression, slowly becomes, I am a depressed person.
Exactly. Loved ones would report watching people become incredibly self-aware. They could eloquently describe every psychological wound they had, but they were ultimately less functional, less stable, less capable of managing life's complexities than when they started treatment.
And the therapist, protected by this idea of depth and working through it, they would often frame this stagnation as a success, as if the patient was just wrestling with profound, difficult material.
But the ultimate issue here is structural. The expert model displaced the necessary role of the community.
This is such a critical perspective. For millennia, when people faced existential or emotional crises, the first response came from their social fabric.
Your family, community leaders, spiritual guides, cultural traditions, these structures provided frameworks for meaning, for mutual responsibility, for forgiveness.
And psychology, the therapeutic expert, stepped into those roles that community and tradition once filled. But the problem is that therapists, by definition, aren't equipped to provide that.
They can't provide spiritual, cultural, or moral meaning. They can only provide clinical interpretation. They can analyze the trauma or the family dynamics, but they can't offer a cohesive, shared framework for living a good life going forward, only a clinically adjusted one.
And the result was profound isolation.
Yes. Clients learned this intense, sophisticated analysis of their lives without necessarily changing them. Families were actively sidelined, their common sense advice dismissed as uninformed or enabling.
And traditions, moral obligations, responsibilities, they were pathologized as undue pressure.
And you can draw a direct line here. You strip away the community structures that offer shared meaning, you replace them with an individual expert who offers specialized interpretation, and the result is devastatingly increased isolation.
The person becomes highly articulate about their inner pain, but they're disconnected from the social structures they need to actually bear that pain functionally.
Which brings us back full circle to the authority problem. The structural problem that links all of these eras was not malice. It was the institutional need for certainty to protect the profession's authority.
The institution as a whole rarely paused to ask the critical question, what if we're fundamentally wrong? What if this theory is actively destructive?
Instead, they defaulted to that defensive position we saw with Freud, asking, why is the patient resisting the diagnosis? Why is the family interfering with the process?
So when the theories failed, when the patient didn't get better, or when the science proved them false, like in the recovered memory crisis,
the path of least resistance was always to pathologize or blame the patient or the family. This ensured that the expert and the theory was always protected from scrutiny.
The ultimate cost of this historical trajectory is just devastating and generational.
Children grew up defined by diagnostic labels handed down with objective certainty. Parents lived with this permanent, debilitating guilt based on reductive theories that were quickly abandoned by the field.
Relationships collapsed under the weight of clinical interpretations that favored analytical drama over simple human forgiveness and resilience.
And perhaps the greatest cost, the one that lingers today, is that generations learned to systematically doubt their most basic fundamental instincts, their gut feelings about what happened, their family's motivations, their own capacity for self-direction.
They were taught by highly credentialed authorities to trust the expert's theory over their own lived complex reality.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the inherent danger of psychology wasn't that it started studying the mind, it was that it claimed unshakable authority over it, often long before it had earned that, right through empirical validation. We've just seen repeated historical evidence of how destructive that professional certainty can be.
Okay, let's unpack this one last time. We're all constantly seeking guidance in a complex world, and the most damaging phrase in therapeutic history wasn't a specific insult or a harsh diagnosis. It was a phrase meant to reassure and command obedience. Trust the experts.
Our takeaway for you is not to stop seeking guidance,
Right.
but it is to always hold space for that critical, necessary question.
Is the insight I'm getting protecting the stability of the expert's theory, or is it genuinely helping me live a better, more functional, and more connected life?
That's the question.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic that you would like covered in a future video.